It's about time for us to go ahead and begin once again. Last time we were talking about the reproductive system in the male. We will easily finish that today, I think, and move on to the female as well. And in case you haven't noticed, we are rapidly approaching the end of the semester here. Unfortunately, I am actually running out of information as well, so I will be adding some additional information after reproduction, because otherwise we won't have anything to talk about. But it will not be on the exam. What comes on after this last set of slides here. But will be additional information, more or less review. Having said that, we do want to continue on and talk more about the male reproductive system. Last time we were talking about spermatogenesis, and once again, the whole point of spermatogenesis is to start with one single cell called a spermatogonium, which is found inside the seminiferous tubules of the testes, specifically towards the outer portion of it, where it will then undergo mitosis. Again, in the male, the spermatogonia are undergoing mitosis all the time and simply repopulating themselves. However, as they do so, we produce two daughter cells from that. One of those two daughter cells will then start to differentiate and turn into what is called a primary spermatocyte. And the primary spermatocytes are then going to enter into meiosis and produce 4 haploid cells. So again, the spermatogonia, these are diploid cells, and we want to end up with 4 haploid cells as a result. Once again, we start here by entering into metaphase 1. I'm sorry, said that wrong. Meiosis 1, entering into meiosis 1, which will then produce 2 secondary spermatocytes. So again, that initial cell will then divide, or I said that. Will then divide into what are called secondary spermatocytes. So again, at this point, we've cut the amount of DNA in these cells into half. But now, unlike in regular mitosis, the DNA is not the same in both of these daughter cells because we've mixed it up. We've mixed up the DNA in these daughter cells a bit more than what we would see in a normal kind of mitotic division. But now we then go from that secondary spermatocyte and we then undergo meiosis 2 and cut the DNA in half again without copying it over. And as we do so, we produce what are called spermatocytes. Now, if you take a look at the 4 spermatocytes here, these are nice haploid cells out here, but you'll notice they don't look anything at all like a normal sperm. They still need to undergo more differentiation to produce the final spermatozoa or the sperm themselves. Specifically, they have to get rid of most of the cellular mass. Because again, when we get down into the individual spermatozoa down here, we have to get rid of pretty much everything except for the nucleus and retain the flagellum. Again, we're going to get something very small here. And as we do so, all that extra material gets absorbed by these Sertoli cells. So the Sertoli cells will appear as the sperm are developing and developing into sperm. They're going to absorb that excess cytoplasm inside of it. So that what is then finally differentiated out here will then detach and move its way into the epididymis. So again, as we are going through this process of differentiation, we shed pretty much everything except for the nucleus, the acrosome, the midpiece, and the flagellum. And that is all that we have left. All right. Sorry for that. And again, it's absorbed by the Sertoli cells as we make our way out. And that is how we actually produce the sperm themselves. And this is all under the control of hormones. As it turns out, the hormones that control the male reproductive system are the same hormones that control the female reproductive system, with one difference, and that is men, testosterone is involved, in women, estrogen is involved. Otherwise, they are the same hormones involved here. And it all begins with something called GnRH. GnRH is gonadotropin-releasing hormone produced by the anterior pituitary. This is produced by, it's produced by the hypothalamus, which then goes to the anterior pituitary and causes production of LH and FSH. LH is luteinizing hormone, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, The names come from the female reproductive structures that they affect. But they are the same structures that are going to be having the effects in the male, but the names are coming from what happens in the female. In the female, FSH stimulates follicular growth and development. LH causes production of the corpus luteum. Neither of that happens in the male. So again, the names are based on the female reproductive system. But the LH stimulates the Leydig cells to make testosterone. Again, LH causes production of hormones from the testes, specifically testosterone. That testosterone then stimulates the seminiferous tubules to make more sperm. So again, without the testosterone, sperm production is not very good. That stimulates the seminiferous tubules to produce more sperm and undergo causes spermatogonia to differentiate into the sperm themselves. It then inhibits GnRH. We have another negative feedback loop here. So again, GnRH is being produced and is produced in a pulsatile fashion. You get a spurt of it, a spurt, a spurt, a spurt, a spurt. And over the day, the number of those spurts varies a little bit. And then the LH then comes down here, causes, inhibits the GnRH so it doesn't get too high. Keeps it from getting too high. By the way, this is a cycle. These values do go up and down on a circadian basis. The male reproductive cycle is a circadian rhythm, as opposed to the female cycle, which is a monthly rhythm. But again, this goes up and down on a regular basis. Testosterone peaks in most men in the morning, falls off during the day, comes back up again the next day. Again, it does go up and down every day. So if you're having your testosterone checks, check it in the morning. But again, FSH then stimulates the Sertoli cells. The FSH comes along and stimulates the Sertoli cells, helping them to promote that sperm production as well. And then, as they're doing so, will also cause the production of another hormone called inhibin. The Sertoli cells will then produce inhibin. Inhibin then comes back and turns off FSH. Inhibin turns off FSH. So again, we have another negative feedback loop here. So one more time, GnRH produced by the hypothalamus causes production of LH. LH causes production of testosterone. Testosterone turns off GnRH. That's a long loop inhibition. GnRH also causes production of FSH. FSH then stimulates the Sertoli cells, which then produce inhibin that turns off the FSH. That's a short loop inhibition. All right, so again, that is where all of these things are happening and some of the hormones involved in all of this. Again, the Sertoli cells are hanging out here inside the seminiferous tubules. The Leydig cells, these are the ones that are producing the testosterone. They're in the interstitial space. And this can all be nicely summarized in this nice figure right here. You might want to take a look at this one. And once again, it starts here up in the hypothalamus with the release of GnRH, leading to production of FSH and LH. LH causes the Leydig cells to produce testosterone, which then does a bunch of things. Does a whole bunch of things, including turning off GnRH. The FSH over here stimulates the Sertoli cells to help with spermatogenesis as well, and causes them to produce inhibin, which also feeds back, turns off FSH, and may or may not turn off the GnRH as well. So again, you might want to take a look at this particular figure. It explains pretty much the entire male reproductive cycle. So that is how we make the sperm. It is then stored within the epididymis until it is ready to be used, and undergoes its final functional maturation within the epididymis. Again, as the sperm make their way out of the tubules, they're not quite ready to start swimming around and doing the things that sperm need to do. They do need to sit inside the epididymis for a while before they can be deactivated. All right. And then later on, we need to activate them, and to do this involves something called semen. Semen are the fluids that the sperm will be put into in order to then transfer them out of the body and into the female reproductive tract. And most of the semen, but the semen is around 2 to 5 milliliters per ejaculate. That's roughly a teaspoon, give or take. That's the amount that is actually being produced. And what's inside it? Well, there's a bunch of things inside of it. Number one, we have sperm. This is actually a fairly small component of the semen. It's not very much of it, and again, there's several hundred million of it. Depending on the individual, anywhere from 30 to 300 million sperm per ejaculate. It has a pH of 7.2 to 8, which you'll notice is basic. Again, sperm do not like acid. Sperm do not like acid. The female reproductive tract tends to be acidic, and therefore we need to neutralize that acid, and the semen helps to do that. It has a lot of bicarbonate in it to help reduce that acidity. Also, the urethra tends to have urine in it, and urine also tends to be acidic as well. So we do have a fairly basic pH to it. It has a number of nutrients. Most importantly, it contains fructose, which is a sugar used to power the mitochondria. Again, the mitochondria need to be fed, and so it contains fructose to do that. Again, it contains a number of buffers, particularly bicarbonate, to neutralize any acidity that might be around there. And then a number of different chemicals that are used to allow the sperm to actually become activated and start swimming around. So again, there are a number of different chemicals inside of there. And also fibrin. Fibrin might seem a little odd to you. We've seen fibrin before. Where did we see fibrin? Where did we see fibrin? And it's actually fairly important for how humans do sex.
It's used in clotting.
Blood clotting. This is what blood clots are made out of. Blood clots are made out of iron. So, in humans, and again, this is a species-specific thing, the semen forms what is known as a soft plug. And basically, the semen clots. It clots into not a hard, scabby kind of thing, but into a soft, sort of gelatinous sort of structure inside of here. And it's fibrin that allows it to do this. Why would we want to do this? Well, the concept here, and appears to be that that soft plug is there to prevent, once you have deposited your sperm into the female reproductive tract, to prevent any other sperm from coming in later, and thereby impregnating the woman afterwards. So it's there to block the entrance into the cervix, basically, so that it's only being impregnated by the first one in there. However, the shape of the human penis is perfect for removing soft plugs. So it is thought that this is part of a sort of a competition, sexual competition that's been evolving over the time, whereas we produce semen that prevents another ejaculate from getting inside there, and then we have penises that remove anything that might already be there during the sexual encounter. In any event, all of which tends to make us believe that our ancestors were a bit more promiscuous than otherwise we would like to think. But in any event, in humans we produce a soft plug. Again, as I mentioned before, this is a species-specific thing. In mice, they produce a hard plug. It actually scabs over the top of the vagina, and it's really easy to tell whether or not your mice have been impregnated. You just look, and there's a scab there, which will eventually fall off. But in any event, and their penises are very thin to allow them to work around it. Again, different species use different responses to try and overcome these kinds of things. But again, in humans we produce a soft plug. And finally, there are a number of different other kinds of chemicals like prostaglandins, which are there to help to activate the sperm as well as to elevate mood. That's what prostaglandins do. So, where does the semen come from? Well, most of it comes from the seminal vesicles. Again, the seminal vesicles are the sort of balloon-shaped structures on the back of the bladder, and they produce between 2/3 and 3/4 of the fluids here, coming off the seminal vesicles. And that is going to include the fructose, the prostaglandins, and the fibrinogen. Again, fibrinogen is the inactive precursor to the fibrin. The prostate then makes up most of the rest. A quarter to a third of the semen is coming from the prostate, and the prostate is basically giving us clotting factors in here, to help us to clot and produce that soft blood. The testes produce only about 5% of it, and that's mainly the sperm and some mucus. It's coming out of the testes. And the bulbar glands produce a very small amount, less than 1%, coming from the bulbar glands, and again, that's a good lubrication. And that's what the semen looks like, and what's inside it. Now, in order to get the semen containing the sperm into the female reproductive tract, we then need to talk a little bit about the male sexual response. And it takes place in two parts. First, we have erection, followed by ejaculation. And I hope you all know what these terms already mean, because I'm not going to tell you. But again, erection is caused by an increase in blood flow into the erectile tissues. Again, we have three erectile chambers within the penis, the two corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum. And what happens is, upon appropriate stimulation, and I leave it to your imagination as to what that appropriate stimulation might be, the corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum engorge with blood. How does this happen? Well, basically, we open up the blood vessels going into them. We have a vasodilation of the arteries that feed into these chambers. And as that blood begins to go in, this, by the way, is a parasympathetic response. This is a parasympathetic response. Again, that's your rest and digest mode, because again, if you're being chased by a tiger, that's not the right time to be thinking about sex. But again, this is a parasympathetic vasodilation of the arterioles feeding into these chambers. That allows blood to enter into these chambers, and they fill with blood. That, by the way, is caused by a compound known as nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator, and it is produced within these, around these arterioles. It's also a neurotransmitter. And causes this potent vasodilation, allowing the blood to flow in. Need to talk a little bit more about that nitric oxide, and we'll come back to it in just, well, actually, I guess we don't. We'll talk a little bit about this now. That nitric oxide, by the way, is being turned on by something called INOS. Nitric oxide is synthase is inside of there. And this is regulated by another compound called INOS, which inhibits it. Turns out that can be, as I mentioned before, nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. And once upon a time, the good people over at Pfizer were attempting to find a way to treat blood pressure. And one way you can treat blood pressure is to allow vasodilation. So they're playing with this pathway involving nitric oxide. Because again, if you can increase nitric oxide, you will lower the blood pressure. And they came up with this compound that was really good at producing more nitric oxide. Did not work particularly well at treating blood pressure. So during the trials, however, the men in the trials noticed an interesting side effect. The compound in question is Viagra. This pathway is what Viagra is using, is increasing the amount of nitric oxide, allowing the blood vessels to dilate more easily and making a lot of money for Pfizer as a result. But again, that nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. As the blood flows in, it causes it to expand, and these chambers, again, are wrapped around by connective tissue, so they reach a certain size, and then they start to press against the veins that are coming out, and that maintains the erection. So the fact that we're filling up with blood, as they fill up with blood, they press down on the veins that are coming out because of the way it's built inside of there, and that prevents the blood from coming out. And that more or less traps the blood within the penis, and creates the erection. Erection is then followed by ejaculation. Ejaculation is now a sympathetic response. This is a sympathetic response. And this involves peristaltic contractions of the tubes. The ductus deferens ejaculatory urethra to shoot the sperm out, as well as contraction of the prostate and seminal vesicles to put the semen in there. And then there are muscles at the base of the penis that will also contract to help push everything along. So again, we have a erection caused by parasympathetic stimulation, followed by sympathetic stimulation, leading to ejaculation. And then everything goes as planned. That ejaculation ends up within the female reproductive tract, and we move on from that. Any questions on this? Any questions on the male reproductive system at this point? If not, we now need to continue on and talk about what happens in women. Now, the female reproductive system, from an anatomical standpoint, is going to be a little bit easier. But from a physiological standpoint, the hormones are horrible, as many of you are probably aware. Again, in the male, we have a daily cycle that goes up and down on a daily basis. In the female, it's a roughly 28-day cycle. And I say roughly because it does vary person-to-person, cycle-to-cycle. It could be anywhere from 24 to 38 days, to 30-some days, depending on the individual. But in the female, we've got a couple of other things that we need to worry about. Number one, we need to produce the sex hormones and the gametes. Again, those are the egg. But in addition to that, because we give live birth, we don't lay eggs, we also have to protect and support that developing embryo and the fetus. I'll tell you what the difference between an embryo and a fetus is a little bit later. But you start as an embryo and then you turn into a fetus until you're born. So again, these are different stages of development. The embryo, that's the early stages, the fetus is the later stages of pregnancy. But we have to be able to support and protect those structures as well. And finally, because we're mammals, we need to also produce milk. We also need to produce milk to then nourish the newborn, the neonate, after it's born. So again, in addition to just producing the ova in the male, we just have to produce sperm and get it out. Now in the females, we need to produce the sperm and then sustain the embryo, sustain the fetus, and then feed the infant afterwards. So there's a lot more things we need to take into account. But we're going to start again with the structures. Number one, we have the ovaries. These are the female gonads. They produce the gametes, which in this case are the eggs, ova. These are the ova, the eggs. In addition to producing the eggs, they also produce a number of different hormones, particularly estrogens and progesterones. Big difference between male and female. Men produce up to 300 million sperm per day. Women produce 1 egg a month. Women will release 1 egg a month. So there is a huge reproductive capacity. There's a huge difference in the reproductive capacity, male and female. Men have a much, much higher reproductive capacity than women do. We then have the ducts. In the female, these are going to be derived from the Mullerian duct system, and they include the uterine tubes, which conduct the egg from the ovary into the uterus. The uterus is then going to be it's the womb. That is where the fetus will implant, and where pregnancy basically occurs. Again, this will contain the developing fetus later on. We then need to deliver it through the vagina, which is basically just a muscular tube, and it connects it to the outside world during childbirth. All right, so those are the ducts that we need to talk about. And what do these things look like? They look something like this. So what we're looking at here, here's the ovary hanging out over here. And the ovaries in humans are on the side of the pelvic cavity, towards the side of the pelvic cavity. When we get into the lab, we'll take a look at this. Then you can see we've got this tube that comes across over to here. This is the uterine tube. The uterine tubes are also known as the fallopian tubes. Again, there is a movement in anatomy to get rid of people's names and give more descriptive terms, and uterine tube is much more descriptive than the ones that are not here. But the uterine tube is there to take the egg from the ovary into this big pouch over here. This is the uterus. That's the uterus. And the uterus is where, again, the embryo will implant and continue to grow and develop until parturition, better known as childbirth. The vagina is then going to allow us to give birth afterwards. It is also the pathway that the sperm take to get in. So that's the vagina hanging out there. And these are the organs that we're going to be seeing here. We look at it from the side, it looks something like this. Once again, you can see some structures that we've already seen. Here's the urinary bladder hanging out right here with the urethra coming out. Here's the rectum here on the back side. And you can see the uterus is then sitting directly on top of, sitting directly on top of the bladder. So again, the uterus is sitting directly on top of the bladder, and that is why the female bladder is much flatter. The female bladder is much flatter than the male bladder, which is more rounded, because the uterus is in the way. Once again, you can see here the fundus of the uterus, that dome-shaped structure on the end points towards the front. The cervix is towards the back. The cervix is towards the back. This is then the vagina coming down through here, and you'll notice in the female reproductive tract is completely separate from the urinary tract over here. Again, in the male, the urethra was both urinary and reproductive. In female, it is only urinary. And the vagina is completely separated from the urinary tract. Now, as we take a look here, there's the vagina. We then have a few other structures hanging out here. Right here, we have a mass of erectile tissues known as the clitoris. The clitoris is here at the front, and this is homologous to the penis in the male. In other words, what I mean by that, in the presence of testosterone, this turns into the glans penis. This turns into the corpus spongiosum. So again, this is an erectile tissue. During sexual excitement, it does engorge with blood. It does become erect. What purpose does it have? Well, it apparently gives pleasure to the female. Appears to be the only purpose of actually having it. So those are the basic structures that we need to take a look at. There are a number of glands that we'll have to come back to in a few more minutes. But before we get to that, one thing I would like to point out here, the entire abdominal cavity, once again, is lined by the peritoneum, which is wrapped around these organs as well. And between the uterus and the bladder, we have this fold that comes in here. That is known as the vesico-uterine pouch. Vesico refers to the bladder, uterine, uterus. So that's between the uterus and the bladder is the vesico-uterine pouch. On the back side, between the rectum and the uterus, we have the recto-uterine pouch on the back side. And these are just folds of the peritoneum wrapping around these various structures. All right. Again, there's the uterus in the middle. If we now take a look at the external genitalia, it looks something like this. And here we are looking at the external genitalia. First of all, you'll notice if I go back one slide, by the way, you'll see this a little better. Change this. You'll notice here is our pubic symphysis. And there's this pad of fat here right on the front of it. That pad is known as the mons pubis. That is known as the mons pubis. So it has some extra padding there on the front side. And again, that is known as the mons pubis there in the front. And what we're looking at here, this structure right here is known as the vestibule. This is known as the vestibule. And normally, you don't see this because it's covered up by a couple of folds of skin known as the labia. There are two labia here, the labia majora and the labia minora. The large and small labia. And these are, again, basically flaps of skin that cover the vestibule most of the time to keep these structures protected and prevent germs and whatever getting inside of it. The labia majora, on the outer side, tends to be thicker and hairier. It tends to be hairy and thick. The labia minora is thinner and hairless. The labia minora is thinner and hairless. And that's here on the inside. And again, most of the times these will be covered up. We only open up these structures during urination and during sex. is when these spread apart like this. But again, we have the labia majora and the labia minora, both of which cover this region here in the center, known as the vestibule. And the vestibule here in the center, once you close up the labia, is a nice moist environment, which is great for growing bacteria, yeast, things like that. And again, because we have it is a nice moist environment in here, right here is the opening to the urethra. This is why we're going to get a lot more UTIs, urinary tract infections, because it is a nice moist environment surrounding the opening to the urethra here. At the front of the vestibule, or the top in this case, you have the clitoris. Again, this is a mass of erectile tissue at the front, where the two labia minora come together. Right behind that, we have the opening to the urethra, and then the opening to the vagina behind that. So again, these are the structures that we see inside the vestibule. And again, normally these are covered up. All right, and that is what the external genitalia looks like. Again, that's the female reproductive structures. Oh, forgot one. By the way, you'll notice there's this gland here on the side. This is the vestibular bulb hanging out here. There's some glands hanging out in here as well. Mainly these glands are producing lubricants. They're there to produce lubricants to keep everything sliding and moving more easily. All right. So those are the external, that's external genitalia. Looking back on the inside again, once again we have these structures we've already seen. The ovary hangs out over here. We'll talk a lot more about the ovary in a few more slides. Coming off of that, we have the uterine tube. Now, as we take a look at the uterine tube, it is simply a muscular tube that comes across over here. One very important thing to note, it is not attached in any way to the ovary. The uterine tube is not attached to the ovary in any meaningful way. So once that egg is released, it needs to make its way into the uterine tube, and it's essentially on its own to do so. So again, the ovary here will produce one egg roughly once a month. It then has to make its way into that uterine tube. Hanging off the end of the uterine tube, here you see these nice little finger-like extensions. Those are called the fimbriae. Those are known as fimbriae. And they are there to help guide the egg in. They're there to help guide the egg in. Again, there's our uterus hanging out there and the vagina coming down. The opening to the uterine tube is known as the infundibulum. That's simply the opening there. And again, hanging off the infundibulum, we've seen these kind of finger-like projections called fimbriae. And the fimbriae are there to help guide the egg into the infundibulum. Helping the egg find it, the uterine tubes are lined with a ciliated epithelium. Meaning they can sit there and they will sweep things along and help create a current that draws the egg in. Again, the sperm have that nice flagella, they swim, the egg doesn't. The egg just sort of sits there and it has to be drawn in by a current, bringing it into the uterine tube. And again, this is a ciliated surface in here to help draw things through. And again, we do see peristaltic contractions of the uterine tubes as well, helping to draw that egg in. So we're going to set up the current in here through peristaltic contractions and movement of the cilia to help get the egg into the uterine tube. Fertilization typically occurs here. Fertilization typically occurs within the uterine tube, specifically in the outer portions of the uterine tube. More about that later. Towards the outside of the uterine tube, it's nice and wide. A wide section is called an ampulla. So the ampulla of the uterine tube, that's the wide section towards the ovary end. It then narrows down to get into the uterus, and that is known as the isthmus. And isthmus is a narrow section. So again, the ampulla is out here. The isthmus is where it narrows down to enter into the uterus. Then enters into the uterus through the isthmus. For the egg and embryo to get from the ovary into the uterus takes about a week. It takes about a week for that egg to get in there. If it is fertilized, when it reaches the uterus, it will not be an egg, it will be an embryo. It will be an embryo that gives it away. If it is not fertilized, it will be an immature egg and will just be flushed out. All right, so that is what the uterine tubes look like. again, we have the fimbriae hanging off the infundibulum, entering into the ankula, which then narrows down into the isthmus. The whole thing is just a nice muscular tube. Yes?
When they take out your tubes, where do your eggs go? What happens to them?
They don't go anywhere. They just sit there. They degrade once instead of being flushed out, they simply degrade and the immune system gets rid of them. By the way, that egg, once it is produced, it remains viable for about a day and a half. The fertile period is about 2 days out of the month. Sperm can survive within the female reproductive tract for 24 to 48 hours. The egg remains viable for about 36 hours. So again, following up around ovulation, you've got about a day before, a day after ovulation is the fertile period when the female is capable of becoming pregnant. Okay, but anyway, we're on that later. That is the, so if it's not fertilized, it degrades very rapidly, just that off. Helping to hold that ovary in place, we have a ligament here. This is the ovarian ligament. And the ovarian ligament attaches the ovary onto the uterus. It holds the ovary against the uterus. That is the ovarian ligament. We now need to take a look at the uterus. And again, the uterus is a muscular pouch. Uterus is a muscular pouch there to hold the hold and nourish the developing embryo and fetus later on. Again, the uterine tube carries the embryo into it, and it will then implant within the uterus itself. The uterus itself, most of it is the body. Towards the front, that you see there at the top, that is the fundus of the uterus. Again, a fundus is a dome-shaped structure on the end of a hollow organ. That's what it is here as well. And that is towards the front, facing towards the pubic symphysis. It then narrows down into a cervix. The cervix is the portion of the uterus that then bulges out into the vagina. This is the cervix. So the cervix is the portion that bulges out into the vagina. And there are 3 layers to the uterus. The innermost layer is known as the endometrium, and this is what the embryo will implant into. And when I say the embryo will implant into, it's just like a seed going into the earth. It attaches to it and then digs its way in, and will be completely surrounded by that endometrium. If pregnancy does not occur, we get rid of the endometrium and regrow it every month. So it is the slopping off of the endometrium that is responsible for the menstrual flow. It's the removal of the endometrium, which then washes out anything that happens to be inside of it as well. Most of the width is known as the myometrium. Myo means muscle because this is smooth muscle. Again, this is a muscular pouch, and most of it is made of smooth muscle, and that's the myometrium. And just like any other organ, we have a layer of epithelium on the outside, and that is known as the perimetrium. Peri means surrounding, of course. So the perimetrium is on the outside, the endometrium, endo means inside, is on the inside, and the myometrium is most of the mass here, is the myometrium. And that is what the uterus looks like. It has these 3 distinct layers to it. All right, again, most of it's divided. The fundus is on one end, the cervix is at the other end. Again, the cervix does bulge out into the vagina down here. And you'll notice there's a space here between the, actually that doesn't come up. Oh yeah. There's a space between the cervix and the vaginal wall. That is known as the fornix. The fornix, that's the space between the cervix and the vaginal wall. It does go all the way around. So you have an anterior portion, a posterior portion, etc. And if you're going to use a diaphragm, that's where it sits. That's where it sits right there. It covers up the cervix and is placed into the fornix. Okay, that is what the uterus looks like. A few other structures here to take account of. Again, the ovary is held onto the uterus by the ovarian ligament. Then we have what is known as the broad ligament. And the broad ligament here is again a fold of the peritoneum, and it's this big broad structure across here. The peritoneum itself, of course, is a double-sided membrane because it's a serous membrane. So it does have 2 layers to it. Running through the broad ligament, we see this ligament coming across here, This is then the round ligament. So the round ligament and the round ligament then attach the uterus into the wall of the pelvis, into the abdominal wall, and help hold the uterus in place. These are there to help hold the uterus in place. So again, we have the round ligament, and then the ovarian ligament is going to be attached to the ovary and holding it next to the uterus. Coming down from on top, we then have what is known as the suspensory ligament. And the suspensory ligament is analogous to the spermatic cord that we saw in men suspending the testes. The spermatic cord is suspending the ovaries from where it's attached up by the kidneys. Again, during the third trimester, the ovaries start up by the kidneys and then they descend down into the pelvis during the third trimester, just as the testes do it. And again, they're still attached to that suspensory ligament, which contains connective tissue, the ovarian arteries, and the ovarian veins will be there inside of the suspensory ligament. All right, and that is what the female reproductive structures look like on the inside. Moving down to the vagina, not much to say about it. It's a muscular tube. It is a muscular tube. It's about 8 inches long, give or take. And again, we see the cervix on one end of it. The opening is down good then, right? And you'll notice there's space right here that once again is called the fornix. That is known as the fornix. The only other thing to mention here is that we do have this little ridge here around the bottom down here. This is what is known as the hymen. This is what is known as the hymen. The hymen is just a little ridge of skin. Actually, it's not skin, it's mucous membrane. It's a little ridge that partially covers the opening to the vagina. Now, again, depending on the individual involved, it could be fairly thick, it could be fairly thin, depending on the individual. But it just partially covers the opening down here. In some women, this will tear during the first sexual encounter. Other women, it will not. In some women, it will tear doing things like riding a bicycle. But again, how intact it is really just has to do with how thick it is. Again, in some women, it never tears and sticks around forever. Other women, it's really thin and it tears at the drop of a hat. So again, the hymen is there. And again, I'm really only mentioning because it's really long to figure. But it doesn't really have much associated with it. People who like to say that if you have a broken hymen, that means you're not a virgin. That's not necessarily true. It can break from other activities, and it may not tear during sex either. Okay. And that is what the female reproductive structures look like. We do have a couple of glands hanging out here. These are the greater vestibular glands. These are analogous to the bulbourethral glands in the male, in that they are producing lubricants. But these are derived from the same structure that leads to the production of bulbourethral glands in the male, and produces lubricant. All right. And that is what the vagina looks like. Speaking of the bulbourethral glands and the greater vestibular glands, these are what are known as homologous structures. So what is a homologous structure? A homologous structure is something that initially we both have, and it looks similar in both male and female, but under the influence of the hormones during pregnancy, it will either turn into a male structure or a female structure, mainly having to do with whether or not you have testosterone. If there's testosterone present, it will turn into the male structure. If there is not, it will turn into the female structure. So the clitoris and the glans penis are the same structure. Again, in the presence of testosterone, it turns into the penis. Without testosterone, it turns into the clitoris. They're the same thing. Developmentally, they are the same thing, and therefore are said to be homologous because homo means same. So they start out as the same thing, and their developmental phase is a little bit different, depending particularly on whether or not testosterone is present. The labia minor, that becomes the body of the penis. That becomes the body of the penis, the shaft of the penis. The labia major turns into the scrotum. Becomes the scrotum. The greater vestibular glands turn into the corpus spongiosum, and the vestibule turns into the perineal rag. So the perineal rapid that Bridges came out and mentioned, only because that it becomes something in female, it becomes a vestibule in the female. And the greater vestibular glands become, once again, the vulvar glands. So again, if you have testosterone, these structures form. If you don't, these structures over here form. Now, unfortunately, in some individuals, something does not quite go as planned, and you end up with an individual who is said to be intersex. And in an intersex individual, what that means is that it didn't really pick one pathway or the other, it did something in the middle. So there are individuals out there where it doesn't go one way or the other, it just ends up something in between. And that is known as being intersex, and it can be surgically corrected. But it used to be, they would do this in infants. These days, they usually just leave and wait to find out what gender the individual happens to identify later on. But again, there are, and this occurs much more frequently than most people realize. There's actually quite a few people out there where it didn't really pick one or the other. It ended up with something in between. All right. And those are homologous structures. And those are the female reproductive structures. Any questions on them before we start looking at the ovaries themselves? Let's take a look at the ovaries a little more closely now. Again, the ovaries, these are the gonads. They are there predominantly to do, number one, produce ova, produce the eggs. And two, produce hormones. So they produce the eggs and the hormones. The ovaries themselves are not very big. They're much smaller than the testes. They're about this big. They're about the size and shape of an almond. They're about the size and shape of an almond. So again, about 5 centimeters long, that's about 2 inches. 2.5 centimeters wide, that's about an inch. And again, not very thick. So again, they're not very large. They're much smaller than most people think. And when we get the cats out in the lab, in the cats, they're tiny. They're tiny. They're much smaller. And again, the primary function, produce the gametes, produce the oocyte. Again, an oocyte is an immature egg. An oocyte is an immature egg. And to secrete the female sex hormones. The main ones we're talking about are estrogens and progesterone. Again, most of the time I'm just going to say estrogen. There are multiple forms of estrogen. Just like there are multiple forms of testosterone, there are multiple forms of estrogen as well. Some are more potent than others. I'm just going to say estrogen in this course, and understand that there's more than one form of it. It will also produce progesterones, which are involved with pregnancy. And so we need to control these two fairly frequently. They also secrete inhibin. And inhibin, once again, it turns off FSH. So again, same hormones we've already seen in the male are produced in the female as well. The inhibin turns off the FSH. And we'll talk more about that. I don't know if we'll get there today or not. But we will talk more about that a little bit later. So what do they look like? They look something like this. And as you can see here on the outside, we have a layer, here on the outside, a nice white layer known as the tunica albuginea. In the center, we have a medulla, which is basically connective tissue. And on the outer portion out here, we have a cortex out here that has all these nice little round structures in it. Those are the follicles. Those are the follicles. So again, we have a medulla in the middle. A medulla is always in the middle. We have a cortex towards the outside. The cortex is where the follicles are. And then on the outside, we have a nice white layer called the tunica albuginea. Then on the outside. A few words about those follicles on the inside. At birth, you have about 1 million follicles. And inside each of those follicles, there is a single oocyte. There's one oocyte surrounding inside of it. Initially, they're nice and small little things hanging out in here. Again, and it's simply an oocyte with a covering over on the outside. That is a follicle. But during the reproductive cycle, the follicle grows and gets big and big and bigger until it becomes a nice mature follicle, which then bulges out against the side of the ovary here. And again, you get this nice big structure and forms what is known as a follicular cyst. Because it's bulging out there, a cyst is a fluid-filled structure. And it is full of fluid. And it's full of fluid out here. ovulation, it bursts open and releases the oocyte, and the oocyte comes out. The remains of that follicle then turn into this structure over here called the corpus luteum, and this is where the progesterone comes from. So again, the follicle, by the way, is what makes the estrogen. So the estrogen is produced by the follicles, and then eventually turns into something known as the corpus luteum that continues to make estrogen and also produces progesterone as well, under the influence of another hormone called LH. But that is what a follicle looks like. Again, normally we would not see all of these different stages of the follicle at the same time. We would see, you wouldn't see all these stages of development at the same time. It would be staged. But anyway, I said that. That is what the follicle, that's what the ovaries look like. So again, the follicle surrounds each individual oocyte, and when we're looking at the ovary, all of the oocytes are formed well before birth. They are all formed well before birth. Again, we now need to talk about oogenesis, and oogenesis is quite a bit different from spermatogenesis. Oogenesis and spermatogenesis are quite a bit different from each other. They both involve mitosis and meiosis. They both involve mitosis followed by meiosis. But in the male, that mitotic division continues throughout the lifespan of the male. In the female, we reach a certain point and then we stop. And we don't allow any more mitotic divisions, and all of the oocytes will then enter into meiosis at the same time. Again, this begins well before birth, towards the end of the third trimester, beginning of the second trimester is when this occurs. In the newborn, we will have between 1 and 2 million eggs. There will be between 1 and 2 million eggs. Oocytes, I should be saying oocytes. These are immature eggs. Will be produced at birth, and that is as many eggs as you will ever have. That is as many eggs as you will ever have. Again, in the male, we're talking hundreds of millions of sperm per day. The total sum of eggs ever produced by a female is only in a couple million. It's only a couple million. And they sit there in the ovary in suspended animation until puberty. Then at puberty, we will we'll have lost a bunch of them. By the time we reach puberty, there's only about 400,000 left. There's only about 400,000 left. And then a cluster of them at each cycle will begin to develop. Will begin to develop from that point on. Again, before birth, they all get as far as prophase, metaphase 1. And they sit there and wait until puberty. And then they start to develop beyond that at puberty. And only a cluster of them will. A cluster will develop, and of that cluster, one will go to maturity. One will go to maturity and be released during ovulation. The rest will die off. The rest will simply die off. And will repeat the cycle about once a month for the next 30, 40 years. And eventually, we run out. And that is what causes menopause. Menopause is caused by running out of these follicles. Again, the follicles are what are producing the estrogen. As they grow and develop, they produce more estrogen. And then at the end of each cycle, they go away. And we start a new group of follicles coming up. Eventually, we run through all of our follicles, and eventually we run out. And that is what menopause is. Menopause is due to the lack of any additional follicles, and only about 400 mature follicles will be produced during the reproductive lifespan of the female. So again, do women give birth to 400 kids? No. 20 is about the max. But again, we lose about, it doesn't take much time to figure out, you lose about 1,000 eggs a month. All right, so again, again, we start with mitosis. And the oogonia, the stem cells that produce the eggs, will undergo mitosis until we've got a couple million of them. So again, all the oogonia, they sit there and they divide until we have a couple million of them, and then they stop. So all the mitotic divisions are completed well before birth. Again, this is not a continuous process like we see in spermatogenesis. You reach a certain point and then you stop, and then all of them enter into meiosis at the same time. They then enter, all the oogonia then enter into meiosis at the same time. Again, in men, only half the spermatogonia enter into meiosis, the other half just keep dividing. In the female, we get a certain number of them, then we stop, and then we all go into meiosis at the same time. So if you're giving birth at 35, you are using a 35-year-old egg to do so. Meiosis then, the primary oocytes will get up to the primary oocytes and halted at prophase 1. We get as far as prophase 1 and we stop. And then you're born. Again, when do we get to prophase 1? That's I believe this is towards the end of the second trimester is when this occurs. It occurs fairly early on. But anyways, at puberty, we then will see rising levels of FSH, and that will trigger the start of what is known as the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle, when we're talking about the female reproductive cycle, we're actually talking about 2 cycles. We have what's happening at the ovaries, that is known as the ovarian cycle, and then we also have a uterine cycle, preparing it to accept an incoming embryo. These 2 cycles occur simultaneously because the ovarian cycle is going to produce the hormones that are responsible for the uterine cycle. When we talk about the menstrual cycle, we are usually talking about the uterine cycle. But again, it is going on at the same time as the ovarian cycle. These 2 are directly linked to each other. And again, after each cycle, we start over again with another cycle. And some additional primary oocytes are stimulated each month until we run out. So what does this look like? Well, to begin with, we start with an oogonia, a single immature egg up here, which simply divides using mitosis. Eventually we get a bunch of them put together, and then they all enter into the first meiotic division. As they enter into that first meiotic division, they become a primary oocyte. So the primary oocyte is one that's going to go into that first meiotic division. And again, all of our oogonia will enter into this meiotic process at the same time and start into that first meiotic division. They will not complete the mitotic divisions until after fertilization. So again, the primary oocytes then during the ovarian cycle, a cluster of these primary oocytes will then start to continue their development and finish up the first meiotic division and become a secondary oocyte. This division is unequal. So again, what we end up here is not two oocytes here. We end up with one big oocyte and an extra nucleus. That extra nucleus is simply expelled and is known as the first polar body. So the first polar body is that first nucleus that is removed. We then have a secondary oocyte, which then enters into meiosis 2. When ovulation occurs, we are at the second oocyte stage. When ovulation occurs, we are in this stage here. This is how far we get at ovulation. And we hang out at that point until fertilization occurs. But very importantly, we undergo a further, the second meiotic division, and expel the second nucleus after as the second pole body. So again, some very big differences between spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Number one, we start out with one cell up here, we end up with one oocyte as a result. So we started out with one diploid cell, we ended up with one haploid cell as a result of all this. One functional oocyte. This is again in contrast to sperm where we end up with 4 haploid sperm. We only end up with one secondary oocyte out here. And because as we undergo the meiotic divisions, it is very unequal. We expel the first polar body at the end of the first meiotic division. Most of the time, this one will simply die off. It could divide again, but most of the time it just dies off. The second meiotic division then expels another polar body out here. That only occurs if fertilization takes place. That only occurs after fertilization. All right, a few more details. Number one, the primary oocytes remain in arrested development from before birth until puberty. So they all entered into the meiotic division. They got to as far as prophase 1, and then they stopped. And then puberty came along 12 years later, give or take. At that point, one oocyte will continue through its differentiation and be released as a secondary oocyte in metaphase 2. So again, during the menstrual cycle, a cluster of oocytes, primary oocytes, will start to further develop, and one of that cluster will get as far as metaphase 2. And that will be what is then ovulated. That is what will then be ovulated. If fertilization occurs, it will then undergo the complete meiotic division and turn into the zygote. So if fertilization occurs, the secondary oocyte will complete the second meiotic division to create the zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg. A zygote is a fertilized egg. And what happens after that, we'll get to the next day. But again, if fertilization does occur, we then end up with the zygote. If fertilization does not occur, that secondary oocyte up here at metaphase 2 gets washed out with the menstrual flow. It degrades and is washed out with the menstrual flow. And that's the basics of how we get eggs. Any questions on oogenesis? Again, it's somewhat more complicated than what we saw with spermatogenesis, which is a continuous process. This is a very discontinuous process. And instead of producing 4 eggs, we only end up with 1. And we burn through a bunch of elements in the process. Which means we're now ready to start talking about the ovarian cycle. Again, the ovarian cycle occurs simultaneously with the uterine cycle, better known as the menstrual cycle. By the way, the mens up here means month. So this is a monthly cycle. Because again, it takes place over about 28 days. It takes place over about 28 days. Again, there is considerable variation from one cycle to the next, and from one woman to the next. The length of these cycles can vary quite a bit. There are women out there who have rock solid 28-day cycles. Other women, it may be 24 days this month, 28 days the next month, 32 days the next month, 14 days the next month. So again, there is quite a bit of variation from individual to individual into how long these might be, and from one cycle to the next, these can vary. But on average, it's 28 days. So we will be referring to a 28-day cycle in this course. Understand there's variation in the numbers. It does begin at sexual maturity, which begins at puberty. In other words, on average, puberty in girls starts at about age 12. But anywhere from 12 to 14, 15 or so is perfectly normal. Again, exactly what triggers puberty is not entirely clear, but it's somewhat variable from one person to the next. All right. Again, typically it lasts 28 days, but considerable variation in exactly how long it lasts. And at the beginning of each cycle, we will see a group of what are called primordial follicles. The primordial follicles, those are the follicles that have been sitting there since before birth. Each of these primordial follicles contains a single primary oocyte. Each of these primordial follicles contains a single primary oocyte. Again, sitting there in prophase 1. Got as far as prophase 1. And at the beginning of each cycle, a handful of these follicles will then start to grow and develop. And of those, only one will reach its final maturation. And that is one between the two ovaries. Only one between the two ovaries will go to full development. And then become ovulated. Will then be ovulated. And the ovarian cycle itself is divided up into 3 phases. First of all, we have what is known as the follicular phase. That's the first half of the cycle roughly, days 1 through 13. This is before ovulation occurs. By the way, day 1 is defined as the first day of menstruation. Day 1 here is the first day of menstruation. And so the follicular phase begins before ovulation. The primary hormone involved in this is estrogen. That estrogen is being produced by those follicles. And it is characterized by follicular growth and development. What is causing that follicular growth and development? Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. FSH will cause the growth and development of these follicles, which will then produce estrogen. So as the follicles grow and get bigger, they produce more and more estrogen, and our estrogen levels go up. On day 14, we have ovulation, in other words, in the middle of the cycle. Ovulation is the bursting of the follicle and the release of the secondary oocyte. This follows a big surge in LH, which we'll talk more about later. There's going to be a big surge in LH that will lead to ovulation. Ovulation simply means that the mature follicle ruptures, it bursts open, and releases the secondary oocyte, and that secondary oocyte that begins its way into the uterine tube. Starts making its way into the uterine tube. This is followed by what is known as the luteal phase. This is what happens after ovulation. And the primary hormones being produced are estrogen and also progesterone. These are being produced by a structure known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is the remains of the follicle. The corpus luteum, that is the remains of the follicle. And those are the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. Those are the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. So what's it look like? Well, it looks something like this. Once again, we would not see all of these phases at the same time of any single ovary, but we would see a group of them starting into this development. First of all, we have the primordial follicles, and again, this is all happening out in the cortex. We start with these primordial follicles. We have a group of them just hanging out there, and some of them will become activated. And they will be activated by the hormone FSH. Again, at the beginning of the cycle, we see FSH coming up, and that causes some of these follicles to start to grow and develop and turn into what is known as a primary follicle. That primary follicle, how we know it's not a primordial follicle, because the follicular walls here thickening quite a bit, and they expand. They expand and thicken quite a bit. And we go from something with a very thin, sort of squamous-looking follicular cells into nice round cells, or cube-shaped cells on the outside. And we produce what is known as the primary follicle. That primary follicle is producing estrogen. It is producing estrogen. It is also producing inhibin, which turns off the other follicles. So as we produce estrogen, we're also producing inhibin to prevent another cycle from starting. We're actively preventing more primordial follicles from starting out by producing inhibin that turns off the other follicles. As it continues to grow and develop, it starts to fill with fluid. As soon as we start seeing fluid accumulating inside of it, it now becomes a secondary follicle. It then becomes a secondary follicle. And as that fluid continues to grow and develop, it gets nice and big and filled with fluid on the inside, and that becomes a mature or tertiary or grafting follicle, which you can see then bulges out against the side of the ovary. and creates a nice big bulge there on the side of the ovary. So again, as we begin to fill fluid, that makes it a secondary follicle. A tertiary follicle is one that is nice and big and full of fluid and ready to burst open. As we go from that primary follicle to that tertiary follicle, we start up our meiotic divisions again. We finish the first meiotic division, enter into the second meiotic division, and get as far as metaphase 2 before the next event happens. And the next event is ovulation. During ovulation, we see a big surge in a hormone called luteinizing hormone. That surge in luteinizing hormone is due to the fact that we see a lot more estrogen being produced. That interacts with generation and causes ovulation to occur. That ovulation simply means we take that nice, big, thick follicle and we pop it open, kind of like this. And the oocyte comes out. Again, at this point, this is a secondary oocyte. This is a secondary oocyte that is at metaphase 2 when this occurs. You'll notice as it comes out, it carries along with it cells of the follicle. It carries some follicular cells with it, known as the corona radiata. That is known as corona radiata. So the corona radiata, those are follicular cells that are being carried along with that secondary oocyte after ovulation. More on those later. The remains of the follicle here, again under the influence of LH, then get bigger, thicker, and turn yellow, and turn into what is known as the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow. So this is the yellow body, corpus body. So this is the yellow body, or the corpus luteum in Latin. Again, formation of the corpus luteum is due to the production of luteinizing hormone. The formation of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then continues to produce estrogen, and now also produces progesterone. Progesterone is required to maintain the endometrial lining to allow pregnancy to occur. That released oocyte makes its way over towards the uterus, and the corpus luteum continues here pumping out estrogens and progesterone. And after 10 days, a week, 10 days or so, if fertilization does not occur, it decides it's not happening and gives up. And as it gives up, it begins to shrivel up and degrade and turns into what is known as the corpus albicans. Albicans means yellow, and basically it's scar tissue. So again, if pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum degrades, and as it degrades, it stops making progesterone, it stops making estrogen, and we then start the cycle over again. Without the progesterone and the estrogen, we can now maintain the uterine lining, and it sloughs off. And we start over again and repeat. If pregnancy does occur, the corpus luteum sticks around and continues to pump out estrogen and progesterone for the next roughly 3 months. Eventually it does give up, and the placenta takes over producing these hormones instead. That in a nutshell is the ovarian cycle. So one more time, this is under the control of a number of hormones being produced by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Again, LH and FSH are being produced by the anterior pituitary in response to GnRH. So what we can see up in here, these are the hormones coming down from the brain. We see in green GnRH, in pink LH, and in blue FSH. FSH is being produced initially by that rising GnRH levels, leads us to increase our FSH levels, and they go up. As the FSH levels go up, we start to stimulate those follicles, and they start to produce estrogen. And as we are producing that estrogen, estrogen levels start to rise. You'll notice we also have another hormone here called inhibin, and inhibin levels also start to rise as those follicles grow and develop. That inhibin turns off the FSH, and after a while the FSH levels start to drop, and the inhibin, which means we are not going to allow any more follicles to develop. And this will also turn off the other follicles that had begun to develop. So the inhibin turns off the other follicles. Only the largest, biggest follicle will continue. The one that's producing the most inhibin will turn off the other follicles. Through the production of inhibin. As we continue producing the estrogen, it acts in a feedback loop with the GnRH up here, leading to a big spike in LH. And at the center of the cycle here, we have a big spike in LH. That causes ovulation. And then after ovulation, that causes production of the corpus luteum, which then also continues to produce estrogen and also produces progesterone. And if pregnancy occurs, we continue during pregnancy. If pregnancy does not occur, we give up. And the estrogen levels start to drop, the progesterone levels start to drop, the inhibin levels start to drop. In the absence of inhibin, FSH goes up again, and we start over. So again, FSH causes the maturation of the follicle, which makes the progesterone. Makes the estrogen. Estrogen from the follicle then works with GnRH and stimulates production of LH. This is a positive feedback mechanism, by the way. So increase in estrogen leads to increases in GnRH, which leads to increases in FSH, which leads to increases in estrogen. And then we get a big spike in LH in response. So we do have a positive feedback mechanism going on here, helping lead to that big spike in LH. That LH surge is then causing ovulation. So ovulation is caused by the LH surge, and it stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum, which will then produce the progesterone after ovulation occurs. Are you still with me? We haven't gotten to the uterus yet. We will go over this again, probably every single day now in the semester. Because again, this is not easy. But one more time, what is happening with the follicles? Again, they are responding to FSH, LH. Those are the ones that the follicles are responding to. As FSH goes up, the follicles begin to develop. As the follicles develop, they produce estrogen. Estrogen levels rise. Also, inhibin levels rise as well. And as these follicles get nice and big, they're going from primary to secondary to tertiary follicles down here. The largest one is going to produce enough inhibin to turn off the other follicles. And they will then be free. Then there's a big surge in LH due to the interaction between GnRH and estrogen. We get that big surge in LH, and that causes ovulation. Oocyte comes out. That surge in LH then comes back here, tells the follicle that's just ovulated, turn into the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum formation is due to the LH. The LH causes the formation of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then continues to produce estrogen and now also produces progesterone. Again, it produces that for as long as we are able to maintain our GnRH, that one, GnRH levels. It will continue to be produced. If, however, pregnancy does not occur, after about 10 days it gives up. And it starts to degrade. As it degrades, it stops producing estrogen, it stops producing progesterone, and turns into the corpus albumins. Without estrogen, without progesterone, we are no longer able to maintain the endometrial lining, it sloughs off, and we start over, we're back to the beginning. At this point, without the estrogen turning off the inhibin, it also goes away. Without the inhibin, the FSH levels go up again, and we start a new cycle. Got it? I think this is a good stopping point. We've got about 2 minutes left. And next time we'll continue on and talk about what happens at the uterus. It'll be even more fun. Any questions? Yes?
So when you go through menopause and you don't have the estrogen, progesterone being produced as much, you said that we needed that to maintain the lining. Do we lose our endometrial lining then?
You stop cycling, yes.
So we don't ever have, we just have the myo and the peri?
You don't lose the entire endometrial lining, you lose the other two too.
Okay.
But yes, it's in some.
Don't you just take supplements though? Or like estrogen?
To alleviate the symptoms of menopause may be limited. So that